Before we get started here this afternoon, first of all, I want to apologize for the delay. We had this thing called voting on the floor, which is something we do here in the House, and so we're getting underway just a little bit late this afternoon. I want to remind everyone that we will follow the 5-minute rule for opening remarks, questions, and comments. Members will be recognized in order of seniority based on who's seated at the beginning of the hearing, going back and forth between the parties. Latecomers will be recognized in the order of their arrival, again going back and forth between the parties. As a point of personal privilege, I'd like to welcome our newest member to the subcommittee, a gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Chuck Edwards. Chuck, welcome to the Subcommittee on Financial Services and General Government. So with that out of the way, let's get started. The Subcommittee on Financial Services and General Government will come to order. Welcome to our first subcommittee hearing on the Fiscal 25 President's Budget Request. Appearing before the subcommittee today are Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, Office of Management and Budget Director Shalonda Young, and Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Jared Bernstein. I want to thank each of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. This will be an important discussion that should not be taken lightly. We're here today to discuss the Biden administration's fiscal year 2025 budget request and our nation's economic outlook. I'm happy to share that this is the first time in over a decade that this committee has had a panel with a Treasury Secretary, OMB Director, and a Council Chair. Thank you for being here. Going forward, we hope to have you back more frequently. It's important for the American people to have more transparency into the financial direction of the country. It is my opinion that the reckless spending and out-of-control regulatory expansion driven by this administration and Democrats in Congress have pushed us into an economic downturn. Over the course of the Biden administration, we've seen families struggle to put food on the table, gas in their cars, and roofs over their heads. This is not the American way. President Biden has continued to ignore the hardships that these policies and irresponsible spending have unleashed on the American people, further evidenced by his fiscal 25 budget request. This unsustainable trajectory is one of the greatest threats to American prosperity, also to America's security and future generations. Our nation's debt grows every day. However, President Biden refuses to claw back wasteful spending, as seen by the $7.3 trillion price tag on his requested budget. This budget is absent of improvements to mandatory spending. I want to say that again. It is absent of improvements to mandatory spending. That's 73% of our federal spending, and it remains on autopilot. Without implementing common sense structural changes, that percentage will continue to rise, and the discretionary spending that funds our nation's defense, biomedical research, infrastructure, and much more will continue to shrink under the pressure. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention President Biden's regulatory regime, which has continued to harm small businesses, banks, and the taxpayers in Arkansas and across the nation. These burdensome and unnecessary regulations range from the SEC's consolidated audit trail, whereby the SEC exceeds its statutory authority in collecting every American investor's personally identifiable information without their consent or knowledge, to Treasury's mature and unredeemed debt, which remains unclaimed by millions of Americans because of Treasury's unwillingness to turn information over to the states. This includes $214 million in my home state alone. In conclusion, it is obvious that I won't be able to support the level of spending included in the President's budget. Our members are taking a hard look at the spending request line by line and will determine a level of funding that prioritizes putting our fiscal house in order, consistent with the Fiscal Responsibility Act. I look forward to your testimony today and working with you on these important issues. And with that said, I'll now recognize my colleague and my dear friend, our ranking member from Maryland, Mr. Steny Hoyer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thank you very much. There it is. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your comments. I may not agree with them, but I appreciate them, and I appreciate the way in which we are able to work together, notwithstanding differences, to come to a conclusion on behalf of the country. That this hearing occurs the same week that we finish our fiscal year 2024, we hope, appropriations, some 6 months after the fiscal year started, is a testament to how broken our appropriations process is. I know many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, including Chairman Womack, share that view. I'm pleased that we are close to seeing final legislative text on sensible, bipartisan funding deal. It shouldn't have taken this long, however. Had my Republican colleagues honored the deal that 314 members of the House came to last summer, we would have finished these appropriations months ago. We must avoid these same mistakes as we start our work on appropriations in fiscal year 2025. I believe my friend, the chairman, shares my hope that we can pursue that mission in a more collaborative fashion. That includes working with the Biden-Harris administration to ensure that our federal agencies receive the resources they need to enforce the law, build a more resilient economy, and help the American people get ahead. President Biden's budget proposal is a great template for how we can continue investing in America. I must say, Mr. Chairman, as an aside, I'm looking forward with great anticipation to the actions your party proposes with respect to the mandatory spending of which you speak. We'll have some discussions about that, I'm sure. By supporting the policies, including in the Inflation Reduction Act and other historic laws we passed last Congress, the President's budget would help lower Americans' cost. That includes essentials like health care premiums, prescription drugs, energy, insulin, and high-speed internet. As chair of the Regional Leadership Council, I'm eager to hear from Secretary Yellen about the progress we've made to implement those laws in every corner of the country. I also look forward to hearing Director Young's insights on the other ways this budget invests in America and in Americans, whether it's expanding access to child care or ensuring the integrity of our elections. Crucially, the budget accomplishes all of this while also reducing our deficit by $3.2 trillion over the next decade. Now, we can argue back and forth, but there is no doubt that the chairman is correct. We need to address the fiscal crisis confronting our country in terms of our debt, and we need to do that across the aisle. And it will be tough, but we need to do it. I'm a big believer in fiscal responsibility, as are many of my friends across the aisle. Fiscal responsibility, however, means looking not only at spending, but also at revenue. That ought to include providing much-needed funding to the IRS to enforce existing tax laws. I was not pleased this year at the figure that we've come because IRS, under both parties, by the way, has been underfunded. While the Inflation Reduction Act's funding for the IRS has greatly improved the agency's taxpayer services, we must do more through the appropriations process to support its enforcement efforts. Every dollar we give to the IRS to collect legally owed taxes, not increase in taxes, legally owed taxes from high earners yields $12 in return. So that every $1 we cut from enforcement, one could extrapolate, costs us $12 in collections. If we're serious about reducing the deficit, we cannot afford to ignore revenue owed under laws already on the books. This is another strong budget. But I'm disappointed that for the first time, it doesn't maintain pay parity for military and civilian federal employees. I've expressed that disappointment to my dear friend, the budget OMB director. Instead, it includes a 2% cost of living adjustment for federal civilian workers and a 4.5% COLA for members of the military. Now, let me explain what that means. You have a military guy, maybe he's a sergeant, 3-striper, 4-striper, he's sitting, he's running a machine. You have a civilian sitting right next to him, running the same machine, doing the same thing with the same responsibility, and getting a disparate pay, both living in the Washington, D.C. area. I hope our guests can shed some light on that discrepancy and what we can do to resolve it. I know Secretary Yellen, Director Young, and Chair Bernstein are here to discuss fiscal year 25 appropriations. Many of us, however, would also like to hear their perspective on one of the most pressing issues facing our Congress today, and that is securing supplemental aid for our Ukrainian and Israeli friends. I've spoken 3 days in a row on money for Ukraine. We're going to go for a 2-week vacation. We call it a district work period, and we all work. So it's not a vacation at all. The young men and women on the front lines in Ukraine are going to have no 2 weeks off. The young people flying their planes, which are not many, are going to have no time off. The people backing them up are going to have no time off. We need to pass Ukraine supplemental now. And it's a damn shame that we haven't done that already. So I thank our guests for doing their part to support that effort, and I hope Congress will follow suit. Again, I want to count myself very, very fortunate to be the ranking member of a committee chaired by Steve Womack, who, in my view, is one of the most straightforward, honest, and effective leaders in this Congress. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words, Steny, and the feeling is mutual. At this time, the chair would like to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro.
Thank you so much, Chairman Womack, and thank you, Ranking Member Hoyer, for really holding this very important hearing. And I want to say a big thank you to our witnesses, our guests today, Director Young, Secretary Yellen, Chairman Bernstein. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your public service to our country. Like the Appropriations Committee, the Office of Management and Budget and the Department of Treasury touch every corner of our nation and impact people at every stage of their lives. OMB, by preparing the President's budget request and then distributing funding after enactment, and Treasury by paying our nation's bills and collecting our revenue that enables us to invest in families and in communities. Like appropriations bills, the President's budget presents a vision for our nation. It tells the story of what the administration cares most about in this country. The stakes for the American people are incredibly high, and I am thankful to all of you, and we all agree that we take this responsibility that we have very, very, sorry. Thank you.
I hit the jackpot then.
Yeah, right. Anyway, so thank you for taking your very important jobs so seriously. You directly influence government programs and services that hardworking Americans need in these challenging times for families. Programs and services that help with the cost of living, lower their taxes, reduce drug and child care costs, and support small businesses. Most importantly, you share our vision to strengthen workers' hands in winning higher wages, weaken the hand of the biggest corporations and Wall Street. Most families today are living paycheck to paycheck. It's not a soundbite or a campaign slogan. It is the fact. They struggle with the high cost for food, for childcare, for health care, and education for their children. And while fiscal year 2024 is not yet closed out, I am pleased that Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate united to reach a compromise spending agreement that supports working and middle-class families, keeps our communities safe, and our economy more equal. We're helping with the impossibly high cost of living. We are siding with hardworking majority of Americans. We are protecting women's rights. We are reinforcing America's global leadership, and we are helping our communities be safe and secure. To continue this critical work, President Biden's 2025 budget calls for vital increases in investments in the programs and the services that hardworking people, small businesses, and communities in need rely on. The President said during the State of the Union, and I quote, "The way to make the tax code fair is to make big corporations and the very wealthy begin to pay their share," end quote. The President's budget request shows how we can invest in American families while lowering the deficit by increasing taxes on the wealthiest Americans and big corporations. My colleague, Mr. Hoyer, mentioned this, but I hear the argument from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle all of the time that we have a spending problem. I would disagree. We have a revenue problem in this country, and the President of the United States is prepared to fix that revenue problem. To many corporations, pay little or no tax at all. 55 pay no tax. Another 39 don't pay their share of taxes. And there is the chronic underfunding of the IRS has allowed tax cheats and evaders to get by with limited scrutiny. I will continue to fight to ensure the IRS has the resources it needs to protect honest American taxpayers from those who skirt the law. I know that this budget blueprint would not be possible without the tireless and dedicated work of the staff in your agencies that adapt and respond to the economic challenges of our day. Secretary Yellen, I'm glad to see a request for increased funding at the Department of Treasury. I look forward to discussing how the department will ensure the wealthiest Americans and large corporations pay their taxes, improve the taxpayer experience, increase community development and job creation, combat money laundering, help implement the outbound investment review program, and support the sanctions activity to weaken Vladimir Putin, Iran, and others of our adversaries, and particularly Putin's assault on Ukraine. But I have to say this, and the three of you will understand my saying this. While I have the three of you and Secretary Yellen, I want to say thank you to you for all of your work on the child tax credit. People told me that the IRS would never get it out on a monthly basis. And to Director Young and to Chairman Bernstein, you know there were people who said, we'll never be able to get $3,600 and $3,000. There has never been a federal program that has had such a profound impact in such a short amount of time. The child tax credit is the most effective tool we have in the fight against rising costs. It's the antidote to inflation. It's about financial stability for families. I'm proud of our hard work in securing what was the largest tax cut for working families in generations. And we must continue fighting to make the full expanded credit permanent. As the appropriations process turns the page to 2025, I certainly hope that's the case after 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, I will continue to work with my colleagues in both chambers on both sides of the aisle to pass final funding bills that continue to help hardworking people. Thank you so much to our witnesses for being here today, for the work that you do day in and day out, and for your testimony. With that, I want to say a thank you to Chairman Womack and Ranking Member Hoyer, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. The written testimony of each of the three witnesses, though you are in three separate zip codes today, have been entered into the record, and we will proceed now with testimony. Madam Secretary, it is an honor to have you in front of this subcommittee today. We welcome you, and we'll turn the floor over to you at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Womack, Ranking Member Hoyer, Committee Ranking Member DeLauro, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the invitation to testify. Over the past 3 years, the Treasury Department has helped drive an historic economic recovery, including through our implementation of the American Rescue Plan. We're now playing a leading role in advancing President Biden's medium and long-term economic agenda, including through our implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. Today, our economy is growing, the labor market is historically strong, and inflation has declined substantially. Companies have announced $650 billion in clean energy and manufacturing investments since the start of the administration. We've also been focused on taking necessary action beyond our borders to advance our economic priorities and national security, including continuing to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine as part of a strong global coalition. Our coalition recently imposed additional Russia-related sanctions. Here at home, the Senate passed a bipartisan national security supplemental package that provides critical support for our allies, including Ukraine, and is vital to our national security. I urge the House of Representatives to send it to the President's desk. Treasury also continues to closely monitor the conflict in the Middle East and use all the tools at our disposal to counter the financing of Hamas, other Iranian proxies, and their facilitators, stabilize the West Bank, and help humanitarian aid reach Palestinians in Gaza. Securing funding for fiscal year 2024 is crucial to achieving these and other priorities, including to support a fair tax system, promote access to capital in disadvantaged communities, and combat terrorism and financial crimes. Let me now briefly highlight several key requests included in the President's fiscal year 2025 budget. First, the budget requests $12.3 billion in discretionary resources for the IRS. Decades of underfunding the IRS had done a disservice to American taxpayers and undermined our country's economic strength. Now, funding from the IRA and discretionary appropriations have driven unprecedented improvements in customer service, technology, and enforcement to ensure that wealthy taxpayers pay their fair share and help reduce the deficit. We need to continue IRA investments and maintain base funding to sustain this momentum. The budget also requests $325 million for the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, which is key to our efforts to increase fairness and grow our economy through support for historically underserved and low-income communities. Second, the budget requests funds to allow Treasury to address emerging threats, such as $312 million for Treasury's departmental offices, including to support promoting investment security in sensitive technologies and the stability of the financial system. Treasury is also requesting $150 million to enhance cybersecurity to protect and defend sensitive agency systems and information. Third, advancing our work abroad requires $231 million for the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, which provides critical financial intelligence and sanctions-related economic analysis, including to support sanctions related to Hamas, Iran, and Russia. We've also requested $216 million for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. This will allow us to build on the significant milestone of launching the beneficial ownership reporting system while taking other actions to protect the financial system and combat illicit finance. All of Treasury's work is enabled by my dedicated and skilled colleagues who should be equipped with the tools and resources they need to advance key priorities on behalf of the American people. I'm happy to take your questions.
Director Young.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for having me here. Ranking Member Hoyer and the full committee ranking member. Delora, you all tried to get me emotional here today. I get to sit in front of my old boss, Nita Lowey's very large picture, and Chairman Freeland has a very small picture by return, but this is a homecoming for me. I've not gotten to testify in this room, so thank you for having me here. And I know a lot of disagreements happen. We clearly have different ways of tackling a lot of tough challenges we've heard here today, but the work this committee does, the American people would be proud if they saw what I get to see in working with this committee. And one in which I have a lot of faith, and one that taught me you may not get everything you want, but you can hold your values and still find compromise for the American people. So congratulations to Chairwoman Granger, Ranking Member DeLauro, the subcommittee chairs and rankings for pulling together and finishing fiscal year 24. As we're here talking about 25, I know 24 remains in the background of what Congress has to finish over the next few days. And I frankly just want to say thank you And some acknowledge it might be ugly to get there, but you got there under extreme circumstances. So thank you for that. Turning to FY25, while we're here, over the past year, 3 years, President Biden has overseen a strong economic recovery, historic job gains, amassed one of the most successful legislative records in generations, grown the economy from the middle out and bottom up, and delivered important progress for the American people. This administration has taken action to lower costs for working families, from everything from prescription drugs and health insurance premiums to everyday goods and services. At the same time, the president has also restored U.S. leadership here domestically and abroad. The president has delivered this progress for the American people, all while fulfilling his commitment to fiscal responsibility. It is a fact that the deficit is more than $1 trillion lower today than when the president took office. It is also a fact that the president negotiated the Fiscal Responsibility Act and signed into law that act, which saves roughly $1 trillion over the next decade. That is on top of a budget that shows a path to achieving more deficit reduction of roughly $3 trillion. This budget will lower costs for working families, invest in America and the American people. These investments will help working families keep more of their hard-earned paychecks, bolster manufacturing and industry across the nation, make our communities healthier, safer, improve our military readiness to protect Americans at home and abroad, strengthen our economy, and more. The budget protects Medicare and Social Security, rejecting efforts to cut both programs and extending Medicare solvency indefinitely by requiring wealthy people to pay their fair share toward Medicare and reducing prescription drug costs. The budget achieves all of this while building on the president's proven record of fiscal responsibility and honoring the president's promise that no one earning less than $400,000 per year will pay a penny more in new taxes. His budget reduces the deficit by roughly $3 trillion over the next 10 years, on top of also paying for new investments by cracking down on fraud, cutting wasteful spending, and making the wealthy and corporations pay their fair share. The discretionary budgets comply with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, just like the bills before you in fiscal year 24, I know you will take up. A few words on the Office of Management and Budget's 25 budget. And I want to thank the team at OMB for putting together this budget and also helping Congress with a lot of behind-the-scenes work finish FY24. Just like the Appropriations Committee I got to work on for a long time, the OMB staff just really punch above their weight, as they say. And I appreciate the staff very much, our budget team, our management team. This committee has helped rebuild that agency, frankly, the career staff to levels needed to ensure that we oversee the budget and management challenges of the federal government. Your support has enabled OMB to continue to take on significant areas of responsibility, leading the implementation of historic legislation and policy that includes the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the PACT Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, CHIPS and Science, Inflation Reduction Act. OMB plays a role in the implementation of all those laws, so thank you. Our 25 requests ask for $138 million, an increase of 8%. The largest part of that is our ITOR, or our Information and Technology Oversight and Reform Fund. The request includes $14.5 million for the Office of the Federal Chief Information Officer and $30 million for our United States Digital Service. Together, OFCIO and USDS ensure efficient, effective, and secure investment of the government-wide $75 billion IT portfolio. We spend $75 billion on IT, and I do it with a smaller and smaller staff to oversee that IT spend. We are losing the fight on managing contractors, frankly. You see the cybersecurity breaches becoming more and more frequent. So just as important as the budget portfolio, the management challenges of the federal government, if we want to stay ahead in how we manage and prevent cybersecurity and, frankly, IT projects that this committee has seen go over, not be served well, we need more assistance in our Office of Chief Information Officers. They work closely with every agency who has a CIO. This is the umbrella organization and they don't get a lot of attention. The budget side does, but they really bring a small staff and leverage their knowledge to make sure the federal government gets what it's buying. And frankly, we need more in order to catch up on contractors. The government doesn't always get what they pay for. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back my time, or I have no time to yield back.
Thank you, Director Young. Chair Bernstein.
Chairman Womack, Ranking Member Hoyer, members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on President Biden's 2025 budget, and in my case, the economic context within which we propose this budget plan. I'd like to start by noting that the President's budget, which includes the Biden-Harris administration's 10-year economic forecast, is the culmination of the work of hundreds of smart, dedicated people, both in the executive office of the President and across the agencies, all of whom have put in long hours to produce this document. I offer them all my deep thanks. As noted, the budget must implement the Biden-Harris vision within the existing and expected future economic context. It is that context I'll briefly discuss this afternoon. In his State of the Union speech, the President took us through some remarkable aspects of the current economic expansion, reminding us how far we've come since he took office. The quick passage of the American Rescue Plan got shots in arms and checks in pockets, along the way standing up a highly effective vaccine distribution program where none had previously existed. This accomplishment proved to be essential to reopening our economy and helping families and businesses get to the other side of the crisis. The ARP prevented mass evictions and business losses, supported state budgets, reduced child poverty, and ensured that the job market got quickly back to full employment. Importantly, the U.S. job market did not just quickly get back to full employment, it has stayed there. The unemployment rate has stayed below 4% for 25 months, over 2 years. You'd have to go back more than 50 years to see a comparable stretch of such low joblessness. The average black unemployment rate last year was the lowest annual rate on record. Labor force participation for prime-age women, 25 to 54-year-olds, is also near its historic high with data back to the late 1940s. As CEA shows in our newly released economic report of the President, this persistently tight labor market has delivered strong inflation-adjusted wage gains that have grown faster for low and middle than for higher wage workers. A key reason for these real wage gains is that consumer inflation has come down by almost 2/3 off of its peak, from 9.1% to 3.2%. That is, we've maintained historically tight labor markets while achieving significant disinflation. Many economists told us this couldn't be done, that to get this much disinflation, we'd need to give up many points of unemployment and growth. President Biden never believed that we could only achieve lower inflation on the backs of working Americans, and he was right to hold that line. Virtually every forecast we've seen, including our own, has inflation continuing to ease throughout the rest of this year and next year. The economic forecast in the budget results from joint work by the three agencies represented before you here today. Our forecasting team faces a unique challenge in that we must finalize our forecast well before we release it, in this case in early November 2023. This can sometimes render our near-term predictions stale relative to more up-to-date market forecasts. However, the new forecast looks good in this regard, as our near-term optimism about transitioning to steady, stable growth was broadly warranted. On a Q4 basis, we expected real GDP to grow 2.6% last year, when the actual growth rate was 3.1%, meaning the expansion was even stronger than we expected. This is above-trend growth, which means it is helping to generate the ongoing strength of job creation along with real wage and income gains. On inflation, things also turned out a bit better than we expected. We thought that the CPI would be up 3.4% last year, but it actually came in at 3.2%, down sharply from north of 7% in 2022. On 2023 unemployment and interest rates, we came in very close to the actual results. Over the longer term, our forecast is largely unchanged from earlier budgets, with terminal growth and unemployment rates of 2.2% and 3.8% respectively. As we show and discuss in our budget release, Our terminal growth rate is higher than some other forecasters because we include pro-growth effects of our policies, including investments in human and physical capital, along with affordable childcare, which research shows has the potential to significantly increase caregivers' labor supply. With that, I look forward to your questions and yield back my 12 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're going to go straight to Q&A. Let me remind our panel that we're going to be called for votes probably within an hour or so, sometime between 4 and 4:30. It is likely that we'll only get a single round in if we're all kind of brief. I don't think it's practical to break for votes and then force our witnesses to stay here and complicate the dinner hour. So we'll just go through one round, and so be as brief as you can. And while the subject is the FY25 budget, my question is going to be to you, Director Young. You referenced our good friend Nita Lowy up here above my right shoulder. 6 years ago, she and I co-chaired, as you well know, the Joint Select Committee on Budget Process Reform. And given what my friend Steny Hoyer said in his opening remarks about the condition we're in right now, the fact is we're in the 6th month of the fiscal year, and we still have not completed, hopefully will tomorrow, the fiscal 24 budget appropriations measures. That said, it is my strong belief that some of the recommendations brought about by the Joint Select Committee should be acted on by Congress. They have not. Among those, biennial budgeting with annual reconciliation and continued oversight. Is that a way out of this mess that we are in right now that continues to send a message to the American people that we can't even do our basic responsibility, and that's pass budgets on time, deliver appropriations on time, and give the agency certainty?
To be quick, this is not a quick issue, we clearly have an inherent process problem. Process, in my view, makes good results. This budget's 30 days late. The last budget's 6 months late. We need to figure out a way to get out of that do loop. And I'm all for finding solutions. What I do worry about, I think there is inherent value to Congress looking at a part of the budget every year. We've all heard a lot of complaints about not looking at programs that are entitlement or mandatory. Well, we still get a shot. It is ugly. We got to find a way to make it easier. But I would hate to lose the one process where everybody is forced. I mean forced. And it's so ugly, if you're not forced to do it, you wouldn't do it, in my view. And you're talking to the old staff director here. I would hate to see anything get in the way of that annual process. But I do think, Mr. Chairman, as you pointed out, there are ways to get that process on time. Sitting in this seat now, I will tell you, managing a federal government in 3-month and 2-month and 2-week intervals is no way to do business, and none of you would choose to do it that way, and it is clearly inefficient. We have a complex world, Department of Defense, and we can't tell them what's going to happen Saturday or Sunday. There's something wrong with that. So I'm with you. I'm happy to sit down and look for solutions. We lovingly call that committee the JASBAPper. I do think there are some pieces in there we should look for. I know fiscal year changes ideas. You're right, we got to do something, but I also have a intense belief that there is something about this annual process and having both parties do the hard work where you literally still sit down across from each other and fight about each of these line items. There's something really special about that, and it doesn't happen many other places in government anymore.
Thank you. Mr. Hoyer.
I agree with both of you. As majority leader, I tried to get the appropriation bills done, frankly, marked up in May, to the floor in June, to the Senate in July, and reconciled in September. That's the way it ought to work. Fairly simple. We're all adults, we're bright, we're able people. We ought to be able to do that. But frankly, everybody thinks if they keep waiting, they'll get their way. And the Senate doesn't like to consider appropriation bills because it takes them too long. And that's a very simplistic way to look at it, but as somebody who has tried for 20 years as a leader in this House to get the appropriations process to run on time in a rational way, and the question I would ask Director Young and Secretary Yellen, we ought to determine how much it cost us in lost time and productivity to do the process that we have done this last 16, 17 months. You don't have that now, but I would suggest that we get that number because that's the cost. The real cost is more than that because of the lack of confidence that people have that this government can run in an efficient and effective manner. Both parties are to blame. This is not a party problem. It is a human problem of delay and dissemble, which is pretty harsh, but I think that's what it is. Now, let me ask a question. $650 billion of investment. When was the last time we had $650 billion of additional investment, which I think was motivated by the infrastructure bill, by the science and CHIPS bill, and the IRA? When was the last time we had $650 billion in 1 year of additional private sector investment?
I honestly can't think of a time when we've had such a response. It's been absolutely dramatic, and I think it's been driven by the trifecta of legislation, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and especially the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most dramatic, important piece of environmental legislation in history, and we're seeing an unprecedented response.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I would tell all the members of this committee, in 2010, I came up with an agenda that I called Make It in America. There were a lot of talk about Made in America. I said, Made in America is what we did yesterday. Make It in America is what we do today and what we're going to do tomorrow. I think the most Make It in America Congress in which I have served since 1981 was the 117th Congress. And I think the results, not only in terms of investment, but the results in terms of jobs and economic growth that we have seen. I heard the chairman's comments, but I frankly think that an honest analysis of what has happened over the last 36 months, from the pandemic on, we made extraordinary investments, we spent a lot of money, and we have to deal with that because we spent a lot of money, we incurred a lot of debt. But it has made an extraordinary difference in the lives of America and indeed the rest of the world. So that's not a question, it is an observation, but I think important to make. And I yield back.
Mr. Molinar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thanks for being with us today. In your testimony, you mentioned emerging threats, but you didn't, to my understanding, mention China, and nor did you mention ensuring that tax credits provided by the Inflation Reduction Act wouldn't flow to subsidiaries beholden to CCP-affiliated companies. I'm particularly concerned that some tax credits, like the 45X production credit, are essentially refundable, meaning the Treasury will be sending a check to the subsidiaries of Chinese companies for the value of those tax credits. Secretary Yellen, do you believe that tax dollars of hardworking Americans should be given to CCP-affiliated companies or their U.S. subsidiaries? In the interest of time, just yes or no would be helpful.
Well, really, it is our job at Treasury to implement the law that has been passed by Congress, and we're doing our best to do that. The 45X production credit, advanced production credit, is intended to onshore important energy supply chains, and it can only go when there is significant production of the components indicated in the legislation has to occur in the United States. But the legislation does not preclude Chinese companies.
Okay.
In the case of the Clean Vehicle Credit 30D, there is a foreign entity of concern restriction that comes into effect this year and next. You can't qualify for that credit if there are minerals extraction or processing or battery components that are from a foreign country of concern like China. But for the advanced manufacturing credit, that isn't true.
Okay, well, thank you, because that is one of my concerns of, these investments by Chinese-based companies and their subsidiaries. We're furthering our dependence on China. And it doesn't sound like there are any current restrictions under current law that would prevent a subsidiary of a Chinese company that receives IRA tax credits from sending those payments back to China. Is there any prohibition on that?
Well, they would help to defray the cost of production in the United States. This can't be production in China.
Right.
It has to be production in the United States.
But the
For
credits they
China,
could send back to, there's no prohibition on that.
there's no prohibition.
Okay, if there aren't any restrictions under current law, was there a reason not to propose any restrictions in the administration's budget proposal? And, I've introduced the No-Goshen Act to stop these IRA tax credits from going to companies based in Iran, North Korea, Russia, and the CCP and their subsidiaries. Do you support that legislation?
Well, I don't want to, we haven't discussed that, and I don't want to I would need to study that and get back to you with I do think the legislation intended to shore up U.S. supply chains, to reduce our dependence on countries like China in areas like clean energy. That is an important reason for it, and I would think about it with that goal in mind.
Well, under Chinese law, a U.S. company that wants to send income back to the U.S. must obtain pre-approval for that transfer from Chinese tax authorities. Do you support incorporating similar pre-approval requirements or any other restrictions on Chinese firms sending IRA tax credit dollars back to China?
Well, I'm not going to take a position on that. Our general stance when it comes to foreign investment in the United States is we want to make sure that there are no national security concerns. We have a CFIUS process when it involves not greenfield investment, but buying out an American company or merging with it. And we would look at national security concerns. But in general, we welcome foreign investment in the United States. China does invest in the United States. And this particular provision that you're talking about in the IRA does not preclude China from receiving these credits. China would be producing in the United States, and in that sense, mitigating our dependence on foreign production.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Laurel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would just make one very quick comment about the earlier discussion about how many months it's taken us to get to having a budget for 2024. I think at the beginning of that, you can have all of the financial gymnastics you want. At the base of this is political will to get it done and understanding what needs to get done and what our responsibility is here in view of the American public, rather than adhering to ideologies that may satisfy one's soul but do nothing to help the American people. With that, Director Young, I want to ask you a question. This has to do with the WIC contingency fund, which is in the 2025 budget. This would allow an increase in WIC funding if the Secretary finds in any quarter that the program has exceeded statutorily and specified participation and/or food cost levels. Cost about $34 million, as I understand it. First, understand that I'm for the $7.7 billion for the program. This is not a substitute. It's an insurance policy. Just let me know. I know you work closely with USDA. Just quickly through the process of how we came to develop this solution. Is it a good solution?
Well, remember, the WIC estimates change constantly. It depends on uptake, it depends on economic conditions. So this contingency fund is an acknowledgement that those estimates change on a regular basis in ensuring that we have a insurance policy, a backup plan, if you say, if the 7.7 billion turns out, my guess is by the time you pass this, that number's probably going to change. We want to ensure that we have full funding of WIC. We believe our 7.7 billion does that, but this contingency fund idea makes sure that the ebbs and flows of participation, that we have every tool to make sure we have enough money for full participation.
And just to note that there was $1 billion shortfall if that hadn't been met in the 24 budget, which we're hoping passing tomorrow, that in fact we would have seen millions of people waitlisted for that program. You know, about 2.2 million women, infants, and children jettisoned from a program that is life-saving. So thank you there. I just want to mention, this is the Council of Economic Advisors report on November 20th, the anti-poverty income-boosting impacts of the enhanced child tax credit. A highlight, it says, between 2021 2022, median post-tax real income among households with at least one child 17 or younger fell by $4,256, due in part to the reduction in the child tax credit. The household's median post-tax income would have been $2,600 higher in 2022 had they received the credit. 61% of the drop in median post-tax household income for families with children can be explained by this policy change. Don't have to tell you about what happened with the tax credit. You're all very, very familiar with that. But I would just say about Treasury, IRS accurately set 98% of monthly child tax credit payments, and that's commendable. And additionally, the expanded child tax credit returns $8 for every dollar spent. Anybody who wants to answer, or maybe all of you very quickly, what would restoring that expanded child tax credit mean to families, in addition to lifting families out of poverty? What are the broader economic benefits of the child tax credit? Eric?
Thank you, Congresswoman. As you well know, and your fingerprints were very much on this development, the expansion of the child tax credit that the President signed into law helped to drive child poverty to a record low of 5.2%. Never in this country have we had such low child poverty, and scholars of poverty, child poverty will tell us how important that is, not just for year one, but for the rest of that child's life. When the CTC expired, that child poverty rate snapped back up. And the conclusion is that the level of the child poverty rate is very much a policy choice. This president in this budget, and this committee has worked with us on this, you in particular, proposes to restore the expanded child tax credit, thereby taking child poverty back down to levels I'd mentioned earlier, and fully paid for as well.
Thank you. With my 6 seconds, I will just say that the proposal that is in the United States Senate at the moment, I find to be lopsided in terms of what we provide to the richest corporations in the country versus what we do for children in our nation. Once again, it would be in keeping with what the president wants to do in looking at corporations rather than giving them the benefit of billions or millions in tax cuts, is that we work to invest in our families, in our children. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. DeLauro. I apologize for the distraction. It sounds to me, as an old broadcaster, it sounds to me like we got some RF interference in our sound system. So if you do your best to disregard that, there may be some kind of a transmitting device causing that. I'm not. We'll try to isolate that. Ms. Henson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of my top priorities in Congress is, of course, to advocate for the taxpayers in Iowa, the working families that we are all here to serve, and ensure that their tax dollars are being used responsibly to support Iowans' priorities. But unfortunately, we've seen a lot of improper payments continue to be a source of waste for federal taxpayer dollars. Actually, according to the report from Government Accountability Office, the federal government issued more than $236 billion in improper payments in fiscal year 2023. For context, that's more than the entire budget of the U.S. Army annually. And since 2021, the federal government has reported a staggering $764 billion in improper payments. So, Director Young, I know you're over there, but I just have a quick question for you. Has the administration taken a single step to ensure that these taxpayer dollars are being spent responsibly to prevent these improper payments before they occur? $236 billion is a lot of money.
Well, one, the ARP provided funds to the Department of Labor to begin the process of trying to improve the unemployment insurance program, which I think most people here will say that is one of the largest drivers of improper payments. This budget also has further proposals that would save $2 billion on UI. So we welcome, and we are starting to see some movement in some of the oversight agencies on moving on the budget proposal. It was in last year's budget as well to do something about some of the higher improper payment programs of the federal government.
Are you looking at using technology like AI to help track these things before they actually happen? I think that would be ultimately the best outcome here is if we can stop them before they go out so we don't have to worry about trying to claw them back.
Well, that's one. You heard me earlier talking about the need to make sure the federal government stays ahead on technology. One thing we struggle with, frankly, and OMB is at the center at trying to figure out how to have proper AI talent across the federal government. And frankly, we don't have that right now, and we need to keep up with the technology to make sure we know how it impacts the American people, but also to utilize it for things like this. UI is difficult because you've seen one UI program, you've seen one. We have a federal overlay, but each state runs it how they want. So we are interested to see how we can utilize AI, but frankly, we at OMB are trying to deal with the AI talent deficit.
As a separate issue, though, from
As a separate issue,
claiming
but it is important. If we want to utilize these tools, we have to have the people that know how to do that. And part of our budget and part of what we're trying to do is ask for more talent there. But on UI, we're not leaning heavily into to AI, but we do have proposals to try to fix those programs.
I hope you'll commit to work with us, continuing that both on the talent side, but also on just the oversight side to prevent improper payments and make that a true top priority. That's a lot of money we're talking about. And want to go to one other topic really quick while I have time. FinCEN's new beneficial ownership reporting requirements went into effect earlier this year, requiring more than 32 million small business owners, including many in Iowa, to, of course, report information about their company to a new federal database, and the penalties for noncompliance on that can include both civil and criminal action. So I know our Secretary of State has posted on his page in Iowa, hey, this isn't a state issue, this is a federal issue, but for such a sweeping new rule, Secretary, it's very important that FinCEN is taking steps to really educate our small businesses on the impacts of this rule. So how are you ensuring that these 32 million new affected businesses are receiving the necessary resources to be able to comply?
So FinCEN has a well-thought-out and extensive education outreach program to make sure that businesses learn what their responsibility is, and they're trying to make it. And I've looked at the demonstrations of how this works. This is easy to file for the vast majority of businesses. It's not necessary to hire a lawyer or any help. It's a simple form on a website. There have been more than 1 million filings so far. It started on January 1, and there's a adequate time, I think, for businesses to comply.
And I see I'm rapidly approaching time, so I'll go ahead and yield back in the interest of letting everyone speak. Thank you.
Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Young, for being back in the room. It's nice to see you here. I want to invite your attention to Social Security as a subject. Today, the Republican Study Committee called for an increase in the Social Security retirement age, and so it's a timely subject. Right now, Social Security is projected to run out of excess reserves in about 10 years. I was pleased to see that the FY25 budget protects Social Security benefits and extends the solvency of Social Security. And so my first question is, how long will the provisions in the FY25 budget extend the solvency of the Social Security program?
Well, as you know, you've heard from the president what our principles on Social Security are. No benefit cuts, ensure that we have enough funding for those with disabilities who receive payments out of Social Security as high-income earners to pay more into the system, and you get additional years in solvency. We also point out something in direct control of this committee, which is Social Security Administration, who has been underfunded, and as beneficiaries go up and there are more people to serve, we are seeing a decline in resources at a time when Social Security Administration needs more. That is why this president's asking for a 9% increase to fund the Social Security Administration.
I just find it astonishing that today of all days, when you're here to talk about the FY25 budget, that the Republican Study Committee, the largest Republican caucus here in the House, comes out and calls for an increase in the Social Security retirement age. You know, that's one thing for people that have desk jobs, right? But for people that are lifting and digging and climbing and carrying, to expect them to work into their senior years doing these jobs, it's not just wrong, it's a betrayal. Because these are people who paid into the system, the FICA system, their whole work lives with an expectation that they would be taken care of in their senior years. And I'm glad to hear that you're not endorsing that. Let me ask you this. What more needs to be done to protect Social Security through the end of the century?
Well, you heard the president's plan. It is to ask those in the top 1 or 2% to pay more to deal with insolvency. The first thing we often go to are benefit cuts. Raising the age is a benefit cut. You worked all your life and the goalpost keeps moving. That is a benefit cut. And nothing gets more spirited when I testify on Social Security, and I've been asked many, many times, like, aren't you speaking in hyperbole, you and the president, that people want to cut it? And we see these proposals come out, and I get that every member is not a member, but it is a proposal to cut. And that is why this president finds it necessary to continue to remind the American people he will not sign any piece of legislation nor support benefit cuts to Social Security or Medicare.
Now, you alluded to the starving of the Social Security Administration for resources, and I want to talk about that. Unfortunately, they have been starved for decades, making it difficult for many of my constituents. I have 175,000 constituents receiving Social Security benefits in northeastern Pennsylvania. Makes it harder for them and people across the country to access their benefits when there aren't enough people working at Social Security. To make matters worse, budget constraints resulting from the FY24 CRs led to the Social Security Administration imposing a hiring freeze, which is still in effect today. Director Young, can you elaborate on what the consequences of a hiring freeze are at the Social Security Administration?
Well, we don't have enough people today to serve beneficiaries. So if we are not adding, certainly we will see people retire from the Social Security Administration. This means they won't be replaced. The problem is going to continue to grow. And then we're going to see people who don't believe their government is there to serve them. They know they're eligible for benefits. It should not take people that long to be able to get in contact, especially if they have a complicated case. But this is just going to get worse. We're happy we finally have a Social Security Administrator on the job. He is talking to contractors, making sure we're getting what the American people buy with their dollars from services. But there's only so much we can do when we have a chart of beneficiaries going this way and staffing and resources going the opposite way.
Well, I was happy to see a 9% funding increase on that line in your budget. And thank you for your testimony and thank you for your work. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cloud.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. It is so true that Americans right now are living paycheck to paycheck, working to make things, make ends meet, and so much of that is due to the inflation that Americans have seen, in large part due to our massive spending. I hope Americans are listening to this hearing, because when we hear from our friends across the side of the aisle that we don't have a spending problem. That is just a notion that's beyond any sort of reality, because the fact is that we've had record revenues over the last several years up till very recently. And spending, no matter how much we're bringing in, continues to be a problem. And so we've got to address our spending issues and get things under control. One of the things that I was concerned about is there's a request for continued funding and expansion of the IRS to go after American taxpayers. Meanwhile, the IRS at the same time announced earlier this year that it's setting a goal for employees to be in the office just 50% of the time in May. So we're being asked to employ more federal workforce, and this is true across all the agencies. Anyone who does caseworks knows that anything from passports to VA benefits to farm help to helping people with Social Security benefits, that the timeline to get cases solved has massively expanded while the federal workforce continues to go, quote, to teleworking. And so the productivity is going down, but we're being asked to solve that by adding more people instead of finding ways to bring higher productivity. So I would encourage us to find ways to get people back to work. We're expecting the people who are funding the salaries of the IRS taxpayers to get people to work. And so I would recommend that we do that. You had a thought?
Well, you know, we're making sure that IRS, as well as all bureaus and Treasury departmental offices, meet the standards that have been set for the federal government, which is at least 50% time for everyone in the office. And many employees have to be there absolutely every day. And this applies absolutely to IRS employees in many parts of the IRS.
To the veterans that I'm working to try to get cases solved for them, 50% isn't enough to show up at work.
Well-
And literally speaking, one of the facilities was a literal work warehouse where the VA records are stored and have not been digitized. We funded them, I think it was to the tune of $60 million to digitize those records. They didn't do it because of COVID protocols. We tried to put in non-teleworking. You cannot telework when you have to literally walk through the aisles and look through file cabinets. And we couldn't even get teleprovisions passed by our friends on the left who opposed that provision. We've got to get people back to work so that we can solve these problems for the American people. I wanted to talk to you about a little bigger of an issue, and that is the strength of the U.S. dollar. You know, it's essentially important to the safety and security, freedom of the world, to have America have a strong influence. We've seen challenges against the U.S. dollar, a lot of it connected to our spending. I mean, as you know, we used to have a gold dollar, now we have a petrodollar that was based on, you know, an agreement really with Saudi Arabia to trade oil and gas using the American dollar. Very recently, we've seen, and there's conflicting reports, but at a minimum, Saudi Arabia is considering joining BRICS, which has been built for the fundamental purpose of challenging the U.S. dollar. And I'm curious about your take on that. You know, this administration has an attack on the oil and gas industry in spite of that, and how that plays into monetary policy I'm very concerned about. But then also this administration and President Biden, when he was vice president, said, and this is a quote, "We are trying to create a multipolar world." In other words, we're trying to create a world where the United States is not the preeminent force. Now, most taxpayers would say that we should share the goal, regardless of where we are on the aisle, of United States remaining a premier influence in the world. So I would ask you, as you're addressing spending policy and these kind of things, do you share that goal of bringing the United States down a notch and us not being the premier influence in the
I
world?
do not share the goal of bringing the U.S. down a notch. I think it's essential that the U.S. Shows strong leadership throughout the global economy and leadership on the full range of challenges the world faces. I strongly believe the U.S. dollar needs to remain the world's primary reserve currency. And I see few challenges, real challenges to the U.S. dollar. It may be that there are BRICS countries that would love not to be dependent on the dollar, but none of those countries seem willing to accept any of those currencies as an alternative for doing business. And there's a very good reason for that. The U.S. is a well-managed country from a macro perspective. Inflation has for decades been low and stable. We have the deepest and most liquid capital markets in the world, and a rule of law and institutions that support the dollar's use as a reserve currency. Now, it is helpful when we want to impose sanctions on other countries. The dollar's role enables us to do that, because by using our sanctions tools to prevent malign actors from running transactions through the financial system.
I understand that, but I think,
there's a
we would
desire.
be, if we have a lot of strengths, but if we're not wary of the fact that historically speaking, when a currency collapses, it happens overnight, we've got to shore up our fiscal.
Need to move on. Mr. Pocan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses. I'm going to yield 10 seconds to Mr. Hoyer, if it's all right, Mr. Chairman.
10 seconds. I just want to say to the gentleman's comment on confidence in the international markets, if we don't pass Ukraine funding forthwith, we're going to lose a lot of confidence in international markets and with our allies and our foes alike.
Great, thank you. Secretary Yellen, a question for you. The bonus tax credits that were created in the Inflation Reduction Act for clean energy projects require paying prevailing wages and utilizing registered apprentices, which are the most important labor standards in the IRA. I believe it's important that Treasury's final rule upholds congressional intent. As co-chair of the Congressional Labor Caucus, I sent a letter yesterday with over 100 of my colleagues outlining several key revisions to the proposed rule that we are urging Treasury to adopt, including treating project labor agreements as evidence of compliance and establishing a front-end monitoring system for employers that intend to claim the bonus credit for their clean energy projects. Our collective concern is that low-road contractors in the construction industry already try to evade federal prevailing wage laws and provide fly-by-night training to their workforce. Secretary Yellen, what steps is Treasury taking to set up robust enforcement of these labor standards to ensure projects pay prevailing wages and utilize registered apprentices? And will those steps include our suggestions around PLAs and front-end monitoring?
Well, let me say that we're working with the Department of Labor closely to respond on this issue and to provide some clarity and certainty on the requirements. I will say that when a taxpayer goes to claim that credit, that there will be rigorous procedures to make sure, given this is, in most cases, 80% of the total credit, so satisfying this is necessary to get most of the credit. There will be requirements when a firm is audited to provide books and records to show that every worker has received appropriate prevailing wages and the apprenticeship requirements have been met. I would say there is now an active market for tax credits. These credits are transferable, and you will also get a great deal of enforcement just through the market that is developing around these credits. Because if I'm contemplating buying a credit from a firm that in the end has not actually met these requirements, I will have spent money for a tax credit that I may well be denied, and there's an additional enforcement mechanism. We see that potential purchasers are asking for a good deal of assurance that these requirements are
We just
being
ask you to
met.
take a look at that letter, and we hope that you can incorporate those suggestions at any final rule. Also, I think this is something my colleague Ms. Hinson may also have some interest in. We support biofuels, the drive for economic growth and creating good-paying jobs and strengthening rural economies. The Inflation Reduction Act established a sustainable aviation fuel tax credit, and the final guidance for this credit was supposed to be released on March 1, but it's still not released. In December, the Treasury Department announced that the updated GREET model will be used as a methodology looking at integrating key greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies and climate-smart agricultural practices. As one of the co-chairs of the Biofuels Caucus, the President has been very clear that he wants to see our country lead the world in sustainable aviation fuel production. What's the status of that fuel credit guidance? And can you ensure that Treasury will include the greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies that were promised in the department's December announcement?
So we are working very closely with the Department of Energy, the Department of Agriculture, the FAA, and the EPA. We want to get this GREET model updated so that it can handle some of the things that you have mentioned connected to sustainable aviation fuel. And this has extended our timeline for getting the guidance out, but we want to make sure that we do it right, and we're trying to get it out as quickly as we can.
And I think both Representative Hinson and my office are more than glad to work with you if you have any questions on
Certainly.
that.
Thank
you.
Mr. Carl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Yellen, on March the 6th, 2024, the House Judicial Committee released a report detailing the Financial Crime Enforcement Network, FinCEN, partnership with the FBI to gain access to consumers' information from major banks posted January 6, 2021. As a way of tracking and targeting individuals it assumes could be domestic terrorists based on certain financial transactions they made, such as Dick's Sporting Goods or mobile payments that use keywords like MAGA. Are you familiar with this report?
I am familiar with the issue that you're just.
What actions are you taking to ensure that this FinCEN is not targeting conservative Americans for their constitutional rights or political beliefs?
Okay, so I'd like to put this in perspective if I could.
Very quickly, if you would, because I got a
Yes,
second question.
this is activity that took place before I reached Treasury.
Well, what are
under
you doing
the
today?
previous administration, and it ended in February of 2021. In the aftermath of the attack on the Capitol, there was an attempt by law enforcement to identify perpetrators of the attack. FinCEN had been authorized by Congress to work with financial institutions in a process called FinCEN exchanges to help them identify. They're required to file suspicious activities reports.
Yes, ma'am, I get that.
And they
I'm-
wanted to get reports.
I'm asking you, what
would
are you
shed light
doing
on this.
today to prevent that from happening again?
This is a practice that has ended, and the
So you're doing
work
nothing
that
to
was
follow
done-
up on it?
There was no requirement for any bank to do anything. Banks met with some people
But-
from FinCEN
but
to
s-
discuss how to
But this
search-
report that came out on March the 6th, you've not followed up on anything from it to see if there's something there that you need to do?
We are following up to make sure that there are no abuses.
Okay.
But it is our obligation to work with financial institutions to help them, help the government identify suspicious and illegal transactions.
Well, I can appreciate that, but innocent Americans, we don't need to be doing that on. And I understand where you're going with that. Director Young, the White House Chief of Staff requires agencies to submit action plans on OMB in January regarding their office spaces needed, but those haven't been made public, and the 2025 budget process doesn't appear to realize any significant savings from buildings, from building consolidation, either in D.C. or throughout the country. Why are we continuing spending over $10 billion annually on maintaining these buildings and securing leases for space that federal employees, when employees are being allowed to work hybrid schedules.
Well, thank you for acknowledging they work. This is about return to the office. Let me be very clear, just like the Secretary pointed out, there are thousands of federal employees who never got any opportunity to work hybrid in the thick of the pandemic and put their own health at risk. But you're right, OMB is central to, and we have put out guidance because we see the value, just like you all do. You see people face to face. There is value in meaningful in-person work. But there has been telework pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. It's about mission. Different jobs have different requirements. I have some people at OMB who work in a SCIF. They've never gotten a chance to take advantage. So this is about mission. We think meaningful in-person presence, even for people who have office jobs that don't necessarily have to come into the office, like for SCIFs. So we are working and we are seeing improvements there.
But I'm running out of time here. My question is the $10 billion annually we're paying. We see no reductions with this staff, this group not coming back. With that said, will you commit that the OMB will lead this effort so we can consolidate under utilizing office space?
Mr. Carl, you, the chairman, Mr. Hoyer, I think we all have an interest. And I've talked to the chairman a lot about this, and she's doing something about space utilization, which frankly was a problem when I worked on this subcommittee more than 10 years ago. And we need the tools to make sure GSA can consolidate and manage as the manager of the federal portfolio. There are lots of challenges here pre-pandemic that remain, and I'm committed to working with you and anyone else who's interested.
Thank you.
Because we need the tools to fix it.
Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions, one for Director Young and one for Secretary Yellen. The first is for Director Young. Medical debt and increasing healthcare costs are a real problem in the country, especially its disparate impact on minority communities. For Americans with annual income in the $50,000 to $100,000 range, Black and Hispanic families have the highest rates of medical debt. And there are products in the market now that seek to help consumers pay for unexpected medical expenses that are not covered by their ACA-qualified health plan. And I'm concerned about a regulation that is currently under review at OMB that you and I have spoken about before. In particular, I'm referring to the changes that will be imposed on the fixed indemnity insurance market under a tri-agency proposed rule that was issued last summer. Overall, if the rule were finalized as it is, it would do more harm than good for millions of Americans. There's universal agreement that consumers should be protected from sham insurance products, and they should not be misled into believing that they're purchasing ACA-compliant plans. However, there are existing mechanisms that address these concerns without eliminating valuable financial protection that's available today through the supplemental or the fixed indemnity coverage. In fact, the FTC just recently announced a $100 million enforcement action against a company that was selling sham health insurance products. And this is sort of proof positive that the administration has existing enforcement tools to protect consumers. In fact, the FTC is just one of the many tools available. And I know that you can't comment substantively on a rule that's under review at OMB, but can you tell me whether the administration did an impact analysis, and specifically one for historically marginalized communities, on what their alternatives are to pay for expenses the underlying major medical coverage does not?
Mr. Bishop, I believe people interested in this are going through public comment now. You're right, I can't comment once it's in review. And your comments and those concerned, I know, have been recorded in the comment purposes. In order to even get to OMB and to OIRA, which is the regulatory office at OMB, a rule has to be seen or have analysis that shows it has a large, a certain dollar amount economic impact. So every rule has to have that sort of analysis that you were speaking about. That's how we know whether or not it has to come in for review. And we believe that process upholds the integrity of the process. It allows large rules to get the comments from the public and other agencies to make sure that we're catching all the issues you pointed out, I'm sure have come through the comment process.
Thank you. Secretary Yellen, according to IRS in 2021, the government collected only 86% of the total taxes that it was legally owed, leaving about $625 billion uncollected. Between 2001 and 2021, the tax gap has consistently ranged between 13 and 16% total owed taxes. Why is the tax gap so persistent, and how does your budget seek to address the tax gap and to keep IRS funded at a sustainable level, which enforces the laws that are already on the books? And where does the tax gap tend to come from? Are there certain kinds of taxes or certain categories of taxpayers that contribute more to the tax gap than others? And tell me if it's true that 10% of the earners are responsible for 2/3 of the unpaid taxes. In the Inflation Reduction Act, we included $80 billion in additional funding to IRS to narrow the tax gap, but also to improve customer service. Some of my colleagues want to repeal that funding, but the CBO tells us that it saves more than it costs. How much additional revenue can be gained for every dollar that's invested in IRS?
Well, prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS was literally starved for resources, and the auditing rates on complex partnerships, corporations, and high-income tax filers dropped to exceptionally low levels. And the funding provided by the IRA is intended and is beginning to really change that and help us address the tax gap. There are various estimates of the rate of return on this spending, but a simple one is that for every dollar spent, $7 in tax revenue is generated. So and some estimates are higher than that. Where does it come from? Well, individuals who have simple tax returns, who get almost all of their income through W-2s, that income is reported to the IRS, and when the IRS has reporting, the fraction that is reported on tax returns comes close to 100%. So there is no tax gap relating to W-2 income at all. But when income isn't reported, an example would be rents and royalties. It's estimated that, so the IRS has no independent information. It relies on the honesty of taxpayers and audits. The reporting rate has dropped to something like 55%. So really, at the end of the day, it's complex partnerships, it's high income and net worth individuals who are, and the lack of auditing and resources at the IRS. They're beginning to use tools like artificial intelligence to identify taxpayers who are more likely to be deficient in their tax filings.
Have to move along. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To the entire panel, thanks so much for being with us this afternoon. Secretary Yellen, the President's budget proposes increasing the corporate tax rate to 28%, one of the highest in the world. This tax hike would undoubtedly put America at an economic disadvantage to global competitors like China. And even though it's touted as a tax increase on the rich, it is widely believed that as much as 75% of the burden of corporate tax increases fall on American workers and consumers in the form of lower wages and higher prices. So I'm just curious, exactly who would this tax increase be good for?
Well, I believe the tax increase would not really harm the competitiveness of business, most studies that have been done suggest that there is very little, if any, economic benefit from having cut the corporate tax rate, that almost all of the gains went to the wealthiest taxpayers. And it's deprived us of the revenues we need to deal with our budget deficit. It's probably lowered TCJA, probably lowered revenues as a share of GDP by something close to 1%. So it partly explains the deficit. The kind of program that I think is good for American growth is the sort of legislation that President Biden has championed and has been passed by Congress, much of it on a bipartisan basis, making investments.
And thank you, because I'm going to run out of time here, and I've got a couple more questions. I'd like to move on respectfully. And so I think we have a philosophical difference on exactly who is the rich. I'm referring to a corporate tax rate increase that's in the budget. A corporation is not a rich individual. A corporation is a band or a group of individuals and entities that have invested their money in order to produce jobs, buy equipment, and that sort of thing. And so if we're talking about Bill Gates, maybe we could say, here's a rich person and maybe he should pay more taxes. But when we're talking about a corporate tax entity, I very much believe that we are placing American workers at risk by not being as competitive worldwide. And so can you reconcile the difference between a rich person and a corporation?
Well, it depends what the corporate ownership is, but stock holdings are concentrated among relatively wealthy people and disproportionately among foreigners rather than Americans.
Yeah,
So when we use the proceeds,
and again, respectfully, because I'm going to run out of time. If we had more time, I'd love to hear the whole answer there. And so again, respectfully, I would disagree with that statement because we're not all rich. A lot of people put a few $100s in the stock market and own a few corporations. And it seems to me like an additional tax, would be very counterproductive.
well, I think you have to remember that with the revenue that we get from those taxes, we're able to do things like propose a larger child tax credit, which really goes to families and disadvantaged, and do other things that are immensely helpful to working Americans.
Again, it's a philosophical difference. We're not going to shake out here. Mr. Chair, I'm not going to have time for another question, so I'll yield.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. Ms. Ming.
Miss Ming is my twin from New York. It's okay.
I'm so sorry.
Director Young, I want to take this opportunity to also acknowledge and join my colleague on the other side of the aisle in saying that I really appreciate how much federal workers work, how hard they work, especially the people that work for you, and your effort in helping me address this longstanding issue with 911 dispatchers. I don't necessarily have a question for you. I just want to acknowledge how much work you have done in helping to educate yourself and your staff on the plight of these primarily female workers that have not been recognized for the work that they do. So thank you so much for that. Secretary Yellen, I have two very different issues that I want to work with you on, and one of them deals with fire insurance, specifically for California. The other issue is related to the work that I do internationally. I want to also take a moment to thank you and the Treasury Department employees for your pivotal work on sanctions around the world. As you're aware, I'm deeply concerned about the future of democracy and the rule of law in the Northern Triangle, particularly how it impacts our southern border region. During an attempted coup last year, corrupt actors sought to stop the peaceful transfer of power of the president of Guatemala. The Treasury Department's sanctions on corrupt actors played a vital role in our commitment to supporting the people in that country and not propping up corrupt actors and wannabe dictators. Sanctions are key to fighting MS-13, the Mexican mafia, and other criminal networks that stretch into many of our backyards. And that's not even going into, other countries, Venezuela, Iran, Russia, and many other places. Can you share with us a little bit more about what your fiscal year 25 budget request and the emergency supplemental funding would accomplish for our national security? And what more can we do to help you staff up the positions that you need in order to further the work that our State Department is doing?
Thanks. Well, we take our sanctions responsibility very seriously. We have a large number, can't remember the exact number, but more than 40 sanctions programs. And over the last several years, the amount of time and effort we've put into sanctions has really skyrocketed, partly because we're now so focused on Hamas and trying to cut off flows of resources to Hamas, and also because of the Russian situation with respect to Ukraine. So these are areas of special emphasis that we've worked globally with partners, and I won't go into the full range of
Yes, and I will
programs, but-
have an additional question that I would send your way regarding Hamas's work in Latin America. So if I can move over to the issue of insurance, specifically for California. There is no help to alleviate the crisis. My constituents have seen their fire insurance balloon from $1,800 to almost $6,000 per year. This is not sustainable. Non-renewals of home and fire insurance policies climbed from 11% in 2018 to 13% in 2021. Most of the top insurance in the state have either stopped writing or restricted new policies. How can the federal insurance office work with states like California, Florida, and other states to help find solutions to the cost of insurance?
We're very concerned about this for exactly the reasons you've given. The Federal Insurance Office has now agreed to collaborate with the National Association of Insurance Commissioners to undertake a very detailed collection effort to understand exactly what is happening to the availability and cost of insurance against environmental hazards across the country. Almost all of the states are participating in this. And when we have that information, we'll try to come up with some recommendations. But I would point out this is an area where states have traditionally taken the lead, and we're going to have to figure out what we can do working together and with the states to try to
We're going to
address
have to push them
what's
to do
becoming
more for the
a real
consumers.
crisis.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Norma. I am so sorry. I should have been paying better attention. Won't happen again, ma'am. It's on me. Mr. Joyce, bring us home.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for being here today. Secretary Yellen, I want to discuss with you an issue that I've been working on for a number of years. 5 years ago, I brought up the same issue with your predecessor, Secretary Mnuchin, during the same budget hearing. He previously referred to the status quo as untenable during the hearing on talking about access for cannabis banking to the banking or cannabis industry, the banking. The discrepancy between federal and state cannabis laws have created conflict in the department's ability to administer that many areas under its jurisdiction. As a former prosecutor, I shared his concern about the business having to deal with these huge amounts of cash and not being able to put it in depository institutions for public safety reasons. Can you tell me what is presently this administration's position on safe banking?
I think we would potentially welcome legislation in this area that would clarify for banks what their responsibilities are. At present, my understanding is that there's a conflict between federal law outlawing marijuana sales and many state laws. And while I believe that there's not active prosecutions, banking organizations do feel compelled to be in accord with laws. And the fact that marijuana is outlawed by the federal government creates an impediment to their willingness to provide banking services to cannabis firms. And it creates all the problems that you're familiar with. And so I think legislation may be necessary to raise the comfort level that banks have with doing this business.
Mr. Joyce, will you yield a second?
I
Just a
was
second.
always.
You're very kind. I agree with Mr. Joyce 100%. It is a shame that the Senate has not passed legislation that we passed in the House. We're putting people in a very vulnerable position where they have large amounts of cash. We're encouraging criminals to break into businesses that deal in cannabis. I am neither a user nor a suggester of using, but the fact of the matter is every state that's voted on it has made it legal, every state. And I appreciate your work and whatever I can do to help you, I'm there.
Thank you very much, sir. So is it fair to say that you share Secretary Mnuchin's concerns and agree that the situation is untenable as it presently exists?
I think it's a real problem, and that it would be desirable to have legislation that alleviated this problem.
Thank you very much. It would be remiss if I did not address Director Young and say I really liked you more when you were on our team.
I'm still on your team.
One of my other top priorities here is addressing the opioid crisis and the problems that we've had with fentanyl. And as chairman of the Homeland Security Appropriations Committee, the southern border obviously is a grave concern for all of us regarding fentanyl. Director Young, how does the president's FY25 budget request address the fentanyl crisis and seek to change this reality? And is there some type of whole-of-government approach that this administration is working to pursue?
Mr. Joyce, I got this question from a Democrat this morning in House Budget, from you here. It's one of the places that gets lost in rhetoric of the year on border. When I was here, this is one of the places where there's agreement, and I hope we can find a way to enact the parts of the president's supplemental, certainly that do deal with fentanyl. And this budget repeats those asks, $1.2 billion for DHS to stop fentanyl from entering the country. You know the NIA equipment, everyone says it works. We bought a bunch years ago. We don't have money to outfit the land ports of entry to put all of those in. We also need more equipment to put in more land ports of entry. So we have a technology that works that's not been fully implemented and utilized. And we'd love to work with anybody to help get that done.
With all due respect, something that killed this many kids in our country, and not just kids, adults as well, we should declare war on. I yield back.
Thank you. Great hearing. To our panelists, thank you so much. Madam Secretary, always an honor to have you here. Director Young, same to you. Chairman Bernstein, thanks again for your work as well and for being here today. I want to remind members, if you have questions to submit for the record, please do so within 7 days. In closing, again, let me thank everyone for being here and we look forward to working with all of you as we continue the FY25 FSGG appropriations process. With that, this hearing stands adjourned. No, you're good. You're good.